All right, well, let's get started. My name is Ken Archer. I'm the VP of Product at Upwave. And for today's Expert Update webinar, I'm really excited to have Dr. Bo Dabbs here with us, who is the Director of Data Science at Upwave. The reason why we're having Bo here is because it's been about a month since the new Outperformance Indicator was introduced to the Upwave dashboard in all of that for all the advertisers, media companies, and brands using Upwave. And there have been several campaigns that our customers have told us about that they have been optimizing earlier and more often because they have these new metrics that make it easier to make optimization decisions, because this outperformance indicator is a metric customized to support optimization decisions. However, because of this, we're getting a lot of questions, totally understandably, on exactly where do these metrics come from. What customers like about them is that they are easier and more straightforward to interpret when making optimization decisions than traditional observed lift plus stat sig metrics. But because it's a newer metric for the advertising community, not so much for statistics, but within advertising, it's a newer metric. People are wanting to know, where does this come from? And well, so that's why we've got Bo here, is to walk us through this and answer our questions. Submit questions at any time throughout, and Bo and I will address them afterwards. Questions can be basic. There are no stupid questions. This is complicated stuff, but also feel free to ask tough questions as well. That's why Bo is here. So without further ado, I will turn it over to you, Bo.
All right, thanks, Ken. So as Ken mentioned, today we're going to be talking about Upwave's new Outperformance Indicator and how you can use this metric to optimize campaigns. So if you need to optimize your campaigns mid-flight, we'll show you how this indicator can help you. Then we'll dive a little bit deeper into how this metric works and the intuition behind its effectiveness as an optimization metric. But let's start with the traditional approach to optimization. So typical metrics reported in brand lift studies focus on the raw lift estimate and the statistical significance of that lift estimate. But for many campaigns, there isn't enough data to get stat sig results until later in the campaign when you no longer have time to optimize. In part, this is by design. These metrics are made to inform stakeholders about the effectiveness of campaigns after the fact. For example, consider the scenario on the right. What optimization decision would you make here? You have one audience that is statistically significant at a low level with only 3% lift, but there are other audiences with larger lift values that aren't actually statistically significant. With only this data, it's hard to make any changes with confidence. But the Outperformance Indicator can provide the clarity, stability, and timeliness that traditional brand lift metrics lack by taking into account a combination of the observed lift for each tactic, the accuracy of those lift estimates, and the relative performance compared to the overall campaign as a whole. So let's consider an example using our Outperformance Indicator to optimize a campaign. We set up a campaign with 6 publishers and collected data over the course of a quarter. In one scenario, we only monitored the performance of the campaign over time. In the other, we used our Outperformance Indicators to make changes to the tactic distribution on a weekly basis. And for these changes, we used a tiered update system that began to make small changes when a tactic went over a score of 60% or 40%. So we're going to start with the monitoring condition. So if we look at the traditional metric, which is p-values, we can see how statistical significance of the tactics change over the course of the campaign. So in this plot, the y-axis is the p-value for each tactic, and the x-axis shows the weeks of the campaign. So when a p-value drops below the gray line here, that would indicate that the tactic will be reported as stat sig at the 90% level. When it drops below the black line, it will be reported as stat sig at the 95% level. So this corresponds to the p-value dropping below 0.1 or 0.05. So here we see that 2 tactics, DIYers and millennials, are stat sig by the end of the campaign, but the overall campaign never reaches statistical significance, even at the 90% level. So looking at the outperformance indicators over the campaign, we see some clear recommendations as early as the first couple weeks of the campaign. The contextual tactic seems to be performing really poorly. It's very likely to be pulling the campaign average down. The millennials and tech enthusiast tactics are both overperforming slightly early in the campaign, and the DIYer segment steadily increases in performance throughout the campaign. However, the end of campaign story is pretty similar for both metrics in terms of which tactics were best and which were worst. So now let's consider the optimization condition, where we took action based on the outperformance indicators each week. Early in the campaign, we focused on decreasing spend on the contextual and entrepreneur tactics, as well as increasing spend on the tech enthusiast tactic. Then mid-campaign, we started increasing spend on the DIYers and millennials tactics as they became the clear best performers. So how did this impact our traditional metrics? The performance of the tactics themselves hasn't really changed much in the optimization condition. The DIYers and millennials tactics are still stat-sig at the 95% level by the end of the campaign. And this makes sense because we weren't really trying to make the tactics themselves more effective. We were just trying to shift spend from tactics that were underperforming to the tactics that were overperforming. However, the one big difference is that the lift of the overall campaign is now stat-sig at the 95% level at the end of the campaign. If we look at the lift of the overall campaign with 95% confidence intervals over the course of the study, we see a steady increase in the performance as our optimizations provide marginal improvements over the unoptimized campaign. So in addition to being stat-sig at the end of the campaign, the measured lift was more than doubled because of these optimizations. So now that we've shown an example of how the outperformance indicator works in action, we're going to look under the hood to show you how we're calculating this metric. And at its heart, the outperformance indicator is an empirical Bayes method that leverages partial pooling to provide lower variance estimates of brand lift performance for each campaign tactic. These estimates use the overall campaign brand lift distribution as a prior for the tactic brand lift distributions, giving us conservative performance estimates that are less prone to high variability. To show you how our outperformance indicators are calculated, we will use a simplified example of a hardware store campaign with 3 targeting tactics. The first is millennials, which is a small part of the overall campaign, but has a relatively large lift estimate. So you can see this on the right, where the orange distribution has a center point around 10 percentage points, but has a really wide distribution, representing our uncertainty due to the small sample size. So you can think of each of these curves on the right as representing a distribution over where the true lift value for each of these tactics might be using traditional statistics. And then the second tactic is DIYers, which has a larger portion of the campaign, but is only, second tactic is DIYers who have a reasonable performance, but are slightly underperforming their overall campaign average. That's the red one. And then finally, we have a parents tactic with a larger portion of the campaign, but only slightly performing the overall. So how do we calculate the outperformance indicator for each tactic? We begin by finding what's called the posterior distribution of the lift for each tactic. To do this, we use the distribution of the overall brand lift as a prior for each tactic, which basically means before seeing any data, we would tend to think that most tactics will look roughly like the overall campaign. And this causes the posterior distribution for each tactic to shift towards the overall mean, represented by the vertical blue line on the right. And you can think of each of these curves as a more conservative estimate of where we think the lift for each tactic is likely to be. So on the right, you can see that all of the distribution center points have shifted towards the overall mean, with the millennials tactic shifting the most because it's lower sample size and higher degree of uncertainty. Because of this shifting, our outperformance indicators will penalize tactics with small samples that are less likely to be stable. So now that we have the posterior distributions for each tactic, to obtain the outperformance indicators for each tactic, we then calculate the probability that a tactic's lift is larger than the overall lift. So visualizing this probability is the area under the distribution curve that is greater than the baseline overall lift value. And because our baseline is the overall lift of the campaign, it makes this metric inherently comparative and easily interpretable as the probability that a tactic is increasing the lift of your campaign. In general, tactics with high outperformance indicators will be those with both large and precise lift estimates. allowing you to find the tactics that are currently the best and most likely to stay the best performing tactics. So I know we've covered a lot today, but I hope everyone has a better understanding of how and why our outperformance indicator is an ideal metric for optimization. We showed that this metric allows for easy optimization of campaigns mid-flight that can lead to large gains in lift at the overall level for your campaigns. By understanding which tactics are helping and which are hurting your campaign, and taking into account the precision of each tactic's performance metrics, the outperformance indicator is able to provide a metric that is both consistent over time and tuned for optimization. This is why our customers can use Upwave's optimization dashboard to better understand if, when, and how to make adjustments, both small and large, while a campaign is in flight. Thanks everyone for joining this update, and we're happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you, Bo. Really appreciate that. Allie, how are we looking on questions?
We've got a couple coming through.
All right.
So the first one, oh, sorry,
Yep.
Can you see them?
Yeah, yeah, why don't you read them out?
All right, the first one is, how often should I be looking at these metrics?
Yeah.
I think really, it's good to look at these as often as possible. As a general rule of thumb, I think weekly is a reasonable cadence if you can do it. Like you could get value from looking at daily and making sort of small changes on a daily basis, but looking at least weekly would definitely get you close to the max benefit.
All right.
We have a few questions coming through on the chat. Ken, are you able to see those?
Yeah, I can see those. So are there recommended thresholds for outperformance indicators? Is there an index strategy we can take on bidding based on outperformance indicator? That is an excellent question. When we talk about thresholds, we have to talk about them in the context of what decision is being made. What we find is that for really high stakes decisions, for example, pulling a media partner from the media plan for underperformance, we find that advertisers are generally waiting until this outperformance indicator is under 5% before making that kind of a decision, because they want to have a really high level of confidence that this media partner is not helping the campaign. But for lower stakes decisions, like you talk about bidding optimization, Samuel. So like adjusting bid factors in a DSP or shifting budget between line items. Well, that's a lower stakes decision. And so here is where you have a really big opportunity with these outperformance indicators, because it's sort of one sortable metric that answers the question that you're asking. Is this feature that I have a bid factor associated with, is this helping or hurting the campaign? And so for those kinds of decisions, people generally seem to be using lower thresholds, like when something is above 70%. Basically, if it has a 2/3 chance of helping the campaign, that they will increase a bid factor for a feature. So other good questions from you, Samuel. Should we first look at absolute lifts and then outperformance indicators, or can we just focus on outperformance? So you can really just focus on the outperformance indicator, because what's nice about this outperformance indicator is it combines the absolute lift, what you call it, we call it the observed lift, and the uncertainty that would be reflected in something like the statistical significance or p-value, and it combines those into one metric, because just looking at one of those two alone doesn't give you the information you need. So something can have a really high absolute or observed lift based on very little data. You probably shouldn't, in that case, shift budget towards it. And you'll see that in the outperformance indicator will be slightly above 50% in that case. Whereas something could have a a less high observed lift, but still one that's above the campaign average, but based on a lot of data. And the outperformance indicator as a result will be much higher, like maybe 80% or more, in which case you could shift budget towards that tactic with more confidence. Having said that, when in the optimization dashboard, when you hover over any of these outperformance indicators, you do see the observed lift. Then last question from Samuel, what about when lifts are negative or trending negative? How do we communicate these optimizations to a client team? Bo, do you want to take
Yeah,
that?
I think that's actually one of the big benefits of this metric, which is sort of say your overall campaign is trending a little negative, say maybe -1%, say. The outperformance indicator will still help you find the tactics that are sort of beating that average consistently. And so if you sort of look at things with high outperformance indicators, those are going to be the ones that sort of necessarily are going to have positive lifts, or at least more positive lifts. And shifting towards them is much more likely to pull your campaign up and get that overall campaign average above 0, which is another great reason for why comparing to the overall is great, because in that case where the overall campaign is trending slightly negative, you really want to find anything that's beating negative at that point. Whereas if your campaign was already being successful, you're going to have a higher bar of what you want to do to move the campaign. So if you already have 5 percentage points lift on average, you want to find something with 10 plus. And so it's very self-correcting in that way.
Yeah. Let's see, we've got lots of good questions coming in. How often should I be looking at these metrics? So I think we would say that we would recommend looking at them more often rather than less often, because the opportunity this gives you is to act based on limited directional information, and then when you have more data, and that can just be a couple days later, a week later, look and see whether that additional data is validating the optimization you made, in which case maybe you should allocate more budget towards that feature. Or with more data, we see that actually that feature was not outperforming, and we should return budget from that feature. So if you make these small optimizations for multiple features repeatedly throughout a campaign, sure, there will be some features that you shift budget towards and then away from, or away from then towards. But where you really get the benefit on the whole is all of the features that you end up optimizing towards early. And that turns out to have been the right decision. In stats terms, this is called like minimizing regret, because if you wait, let's say you wait till the end of the campaign, well, obviously you can't do much with that information. And so you have a lot of regret. Oh, wow, if only we had shifted the budget towards these tactics. And let's say you only get one mid-campaign read. Well, you still have quite a lot of regret, because if you make just one optimization decision, well, some of those are going to be wrong, and you won't know until the end of the campaign if they were wrong or not. By the more often you look, the more you can minimize regret and maximize the end of campaign lift. Let's see. Here's a question. So does that mean tactics with the highest outperformance indicator is the best tactic? Why don't you take that one, Bo?
Yeah, so I guess I would say it is the one that is most likely to be the best tactic, because it literally is the probability that it's beating the average. So if it has the highest outperformance indicator, it's the most likely to be beating the average, and generally most likely to be the best. And so what does best mean here? So best doesn't necessarily mean the highest lift. So a lot of times you'll have this campaign with a really small segment that looks really positive, but you're really uncertain on where it is. And so in general, I wouldn't call that the best one. It's sort of the apparent best. So the outperformance indicator won't always pick the one with the highest lift, but it will pick the one that is most likely to stay above average and stay with a consistently high lift towards sort of going towards the end of the campaign. And so most of the times it will pick the one that is literally the best tactic.
Yeah. All right. Here's a great question. When I make optimizations, I need to factor in constraints on what I can and cannot change. Is this just something I can keep in mind when reviewing outperformance indicators, or is there a better way to do this? So I think we would say that, yeah, there's constraints like how much headroom is there for a tactic. It could be that you've already maxed out all of the inventory, or or cost. Obviously, cost is not being factored in, so you have to factor in cost into this. And finally, you would need to factor in scale. How much scope are you getting? So you may have, which is related to headroom. So you may have a tactic that's just slightly outperforming, but it has a ton of volume, and a ton of reach, I should say, and a lot of headroom on top of that. So yeah, you always have to make these decisions sort of in the context of how high stakes a decision is this, and what are the other factors on the decision, like cost, reach. Those are the ones we hear about the most. But what's nice is that with this outperformance indicator, you kind of have one number that, in terms of ad effectiveness into that equation, rather than two numbers, observed lift and uncertainty about that lift, which is stat sig, kind of feeding in, and you don't know how the two relate to each other. Now you just have one number to then put into the context of the decision being made. Another question, two, I guess, related questions. How quickly into my campaign will this tab populate? And is this a new feature request? So this is not a new feature request. This is available on all live campaigns right now on the Upwave dashboard. So it's not something you have to ask for. And it populates as soon as we start showing a brand lift reads for your campaign as a whole, and then obviously for individual tactics.
Yeah, so in part because we're taking into account the sort of level of uncertainty or precision for each estimate, we can start making sort of reports on this optimization metric early in the campaign, even if we don't have a lot of sample, because the metric is inherently taking into account that uncertainty. And so early in the campaign, you may not see a lot of really large or small OI scores, but that's sort of by design.
Yeah. Yeah. Another question. So are these optimization indicators statistically significant? We'll let Bo answer that.
So that's a little tricky. So you can't really talk about statistical significance with the optimization indicators. And it's really because they're kind of talking about two different things. So statistical significance is talking about p-values, which is sort of what it literally is telling you what is the probability that you would see this data given that there's no lift. And instead of focusing on like what would happen if there was no lift, we're trying to say literally what is a distribution or a probability that the lift for this tactic really is bigger than the overall campaign. So you can really think of these as sort of an actual chance that something's is true. And so if you have a 75% outperformance indicator, that means that there's a 75% chance that you're beating the campaign average. So it's actually a lot easier to think about, but you can't say that it is or isn't statistically significant because it just represents a probability itself.
Yeah, yeah. Another question, is this data included in the raw export? This is referring to the crosstabs that you can download in Upwave dashboard. You can download the crosstabs for every daily read up to the current date. And I believe the answer is yes. Is that right, Bo?
Yes, they're definitely in the crosstabs.
Yeah, that's right. Another question, are there rules of thumb on thresholds to use for the outperformance indicator? Yeah, we talked about this earlier. there are common practices that we observe, and they're always relative to the decision being made. One of the this relates to another question: how should I think about big changes, cutting a publisher versus small changes, like creative rotation weights, frequency caps, or DSP bidding? So yeah, with bigger changes, the common practice that we observe is to wait for the outperformance indicator to give you a much higher or lower level of confidence in a tactic. So people seem to be waiting to cut publishers until there's like less than a 5% chance. But even that is kind of relative, again, to the relationship with the publisher. So you can have a publisher that you did custom creative format with, and that was a lot of investment. And well, there you might even wait for it to be a little lower than 5%, because that would be quite a decision, quite a sunk cost. On the other hand, you may have a publisher with a much more arm's length relationship, in which case, when that is your first time working with this publisher and you weren't sure about it in the first place, then maybe 10% would be enough. But what we see a lot of advertisers doing, agencies in particular, is once it gets below to say 20% or 15%, initiating a conversation with the publisher, maybe also looking at our targeting verification data within the dashboard to see if the reason why a publisher appears to be underperforming is because of who they're reaching, which we provide transparency to in the targeting verification tab. Well, that's a lower stakes decision. It's just having a conversation. And this enables you to have that conversation with publishers earlier in the campaign. A lot of times that will fix the issue. All right, let's see if we hit all of the questions. So many great questions here. Oh, one more. Oh, no, we answered that question. So yeah, we answered all the questions. Thanks everyone for this fantastic list of questions. And if you have any other follow-up questions on optimization within the Upwave dashboard using the Outperformance Indicator, contact your CSM and they can help you or connect you with resources here within Upwave. Thanks so much for joining us, and look forward to talking with you at our next expert update.